Tonight, the world is watching a familiar tension evolve into something far more dangerous, as a conflict that has raged on the far edges of Eastern Europe suddenly forces the United States to confront a reality it has tried for years to avoid. A reality in which the limits of American resolve, the boundaries of Western unity, and the assumptions that have governed the world since the Cold War are tested all at once. The spark this time is not just a missile strike, not just another headline buried among the usual noise of global conflict. It is a blow that has pushed the war in Ukraine onto a collision course with Washington, challenging the very idea of how far the West is willing to go when confronted with direct warnings and escalating threats from Moscow. The new crisis began with a Ukrainian operation deep inside territory Russia claims as its own, an area Moscow has occupied, militarized, and fortified for years. The strike was executed with precision and confidence, hitting a Russian military installation that analysts say formed part of the Kremlin's long-range attack network. And while Ukraine has carried out numerous operations inside occupied zones before, what makes this moment different is not the target itself, but what was reportedly used to hit it. Western-supplied long-range weapons, systems capable of reaching far beyond the traditional front line. Weapons that, according to early assessments, may have come from stock approved by Washington under its evolving support strategy for Kyiv. Within hours of the explosion, the Kremlin staged what looked like a carefully choreographed diplomatic scene: lights, cameras, stern officials, and a deliberate message directed not only at the Ukrainian government, but squarely at the United States. Russia summoned the U.S. ambassador in Moscow in a move that diplomats around the world immediately recognized as exceptional. Summons of this kind are not routine. They are signals, sometimes precursors to something more serious, often used to warn that a boundary, real or imagined in Moscow's view, has been crossed. As the ambassador arrived, surrounded by cameras and an unusually hostile press environment, Russian officials delivered what they called a severe warning. Their statement accused Washington of enabling what they described as an attack on Russian territory using American-made weapons, making the United States directly responsible for the consequences. The language was sharp, the tone was theatrical, but behind the performance was a message that world capitals have been analyzing with growing concern. Russia wants to reframe this conflict from an invasion of Ukraine into a confrontation with the United States itself. Inside Washington, the alarms were instant. The National Security Council convened an urgent briefing pulling in leaders from the Pentagon, State Department, intelligence agencies, and U.S.-European Command. In moments like this, before decisions are made, there is first a rush for clarity. What exactly happened? Did Ukraine use systems that require U.S. approval? Was the target truly military? Did satellite data confirm Russia's claims? Were Russian forces preparing a second move of their own? And the most delicate question of all, was Moscow escalating rhetorically or operationally? Military and intelligence officials pored over early data. Imagery analysts compared the blast site to pre-strike satellite captures. Signals intelligence was reviewed for changes in Russian command chatter. Analysts monitored troop repositioning, air defense posture, and cyber activity across Russian networks. So far, there were signs of elevated tension, but not of immediate kinetic retaliation. Still, Washington understood that Russia's diplomatic posturing was not empty. Moscow's strategy has long relied on portraying itself as a victim of Western aggression, especially when its own position on the battlefield is pressured. But while the intelligence community tried to establish the facts, the State Department faced a different battle, one of messaging. Officials debated privately whether to downplay the event, respond firmly, or strike a balance between rejecting Russian accusations and avoiding unnecessary escalation. The final response attempted that balance. The U.S. reiterated that Ukraine has the right to defend itself against military assets used to attack its cities. It emphasized that the U.S. is not a direct participant in the war. It clarified that Washington does not encourage strikes on internationally recognized Russian soil. And it reminded the world that Russia remains the aggressor, violating international law, targeting civilians and occupying territory through force. But beneath the public statements was a more complicated reality. This strike and Russia's reaction touch on one of the most sensitive questions of the war. How far can Ukraine go in destroying the infrastructure Russia uses to wage its campaign? For Kyiv, the logic is simple. If Russia launches missiles from bases in Crimea, why shouldn't those bases be targeted? If Russian depots store weapons that destroy Ukrainian energy grids, why should they be considered off-limits? If Moscow's advantage lies in sanctuaries behind the front lines, why should those sanctuaries remain untouched? But Western governments have always walked a tightrope, giving Ukraine the tools to defend itself while trying to prevent the conflict from spiraling into a direct East-West confrontation. And now, Russia is trying to force a choice. Moscow's message is clear. Strikes like this will be treated as U.S.-enabled attacks on Russian territory and therefore subject to retaliation. That is a dangerous line for any nuclear-armed nation to draw, especially one that has repeatedly used nuclear threats as a component of its geopolitical strategy. But Washington cannot make decisions in a vacuum. It must consider its allies, many of whom have grown increasingly supportive of allowing Ukraine to strike deeper into occupied territory. It must consider Ukraine, whose survival depends on neutralizing Russian bases that have long operated with impunity. It must consider American public opinion, where support remains, but fatigue is rising. And it must consider global implications, because the world is full of countries watching this moment with their own strategic calculations in mind. In Beijing, officials will study how Washington responds to nuclear-backed threats. In Tehran and North Korea, leaders will gauge the limits of American deterrence. In Europe, governments will wait to see whether the U.S. stance remains firm or begins to fracture under pressure. And in Kyiv, civilians sitting in cold apartments and darkened streets will measure this moment by a simpler equation. Does the West believe Ukraine should merely survive, or does it believe Ukraine should win? The U.S. now faces two distinct paths, each carrying significant consequences. One option is to quietly restrict how Ukraine uses American weapons, tightening permissions, limiting where long-range systems can strike, adding layers of approval, or slowing future deliveries. This would cool tensions temporarily, give Washington breathing room, and avoid an immediate confrontation. It would also, as many experts fear, embolden Russia, because if Russia can alter U.S. policy simply by issuing warnings, then every future Ukrainian strike becomes a bargaining chip Moscow can manipulate. The second option is to stand its ground, or even expand Ukraine's strike permissions while maintaining measured rhetoric. This approach sends a different message. Russia cannot shield its military assets just by declaring occupied territory as its own. Ukraine has the right to neutralize the weapons killing its civilians, and Western support cannot be dictated by Moscow's threats. This path does not eliminate risk, but it prevents Russia from establishing a precedent that intimidation works. But what makes this moment especially delicate is the timing. Russia has intensified its winter campaign against Ukraine's power plants and civilian infrastructure, launching devastating waves of missiles and drones. Millions are facing blackouts, heating shortages, and the harsh reality of another winter under fire. In that context, Ukraine's strike was an act of necessity, an act meant to disrupt the very systems enabling Russia's bombardment. This is why Russia reacted so sharply, because the more Ukraine is able to hit Russian bases, the more Russia loses its strategic advantage, and the more effective Ukraine becomes, the more Russia relies on political escalation, threats, warnings, dramatic summonses to slow Western support. What happens next will shape not just the war, but the architecture of global deterrence for years to come. If the U.S. signals that it will support Ukraine only up to the point where Russia becomes uncomfortable, then the message to authoritarian powers is clear: threats work. But if the U.S. and its allies maintain their position, refusing to let Moscow redefine the rules, then Russia's warning becomes evidence of a shifting battlefield, proof that its sanctuaries are no longer untouchable. Tonight, the world stands at an inflection point. In Washington, officials know that every decision will reverberate across alliances, domestic politics, and long-term strategy. In Moscow, leaders are calculating how far they can push before provoking consequences they cannot control. In Europe, governments brace for another winter of instability. And in Ukraine, civilians endure the cost of every missile fired, every blackout imposed, every threat issued from afar. The question facing the United States is no longer theoretical, it is immediate, urgent, and unavoidable. Will American support for Ukraine bend under pressure from Moscow, or will it hold in the face of escalation? Will this moment be remembered as the night Russia discovered that warnings could shift U.S. policy, or the night the Kremlin learned that the West's resolve is stronger than its threats? In the coming days, the rhetoric will continue, the diplomatic theater will intensify. Analysts will scrutinize every troop movement, every announcement,